the illusion of free will, how our brains make choices. Right now, as you're watching this video, you think you're choosing to keep watching. But what if I told you that decision was made 7 seconds ago, before you were even consciously aware of it? Imagine if every choice you've ever made, what you ate for breakfast, who you fell in love with, your career path, even clicking on this video, was actually predetermined by electrical impulses firing in your brain before you had any say in the matter. What if the voice in your head that feels like you making decisions is actually just a narrator, commentating on choices that have already been made by unconscious processes you can't access or control? Prepare to have your fundamental sense of self challenged, because new neuroscience is revealing something profoundly unsettling. The person you think is in control might not actually exist in the way you believe. Counterintuitive revelation. Forget everything you thought you knew about making decisions. While you've been living your life believing you're the author of your choices, the captain of your ship, the master of your fate, scientists have been watching your brain make decisions without you. And what they've discovered is revolutionizing our understanding of human consciousness and fundamentally challenging our most basic assumptions about what it means to be human. Your choices aren't about conscious intent. They're about the intricate dance of neurons, firing in patterns shaped by your genetics, your childhood experiences, your neurochemistry, your last meal, your current stress levels, and 1,000 other factors you never consciously considered. Today, we're going deep into the neuroscience, psychology, and philosophy that's shattering our assumptions about free will. We'll explore the experiments that show your brain deciding before you do, the hidden biases steering your every choice, the architecture of your brain that constrains what you can even consider choosing, and ultimately, what it means to live in a world where free will might be the greatest illusion your mind has ever constructed. And I promise you, by the end of this video, you'll never think about your own decisions the same way again. You might even question whether you exist at all in the way you currently think you do. So buckle up. This is going to be a long, deep dive. And there's no turning back now, though whether you chose to continue watching or were always going to continue watching is precisely the question we're here to explore. The intuition trap. Why free will feels so real. Let me start with something we can all relate to. A moment that happens dozens of times every single day. Picture this, you're at a restaurant staring at a menu. You're debating between the burger and the salad. You consider your options. The burger sounds absolutely delicious. You can almost taste it, but you've been trying to eat healthier lately. You think about how you felt sluggish after that heavy meal yesterday. You remember your New Year's resolution. After what feels like genuine deliberation, weighing the pros and cons, you confidently tell the waiter, "I'll have the salad." That felt like a choice, didn't it? A conscious, deliberate decision where you, the real you, the conscious thinking you, weighed the options and made a selection based on your values and preferences. This subjective experience, this powerful, undeniable feeling of agency, is one of the most fundamental aspects of being human. It's woven into the fabric of our daily existence. Every moment of every day, we feel ourselves making choices. Small ones, should I check my phone now or later? Medium ones, should I take this job or that one? Large ones, should I commit to this relationship, move to this city, pursue this dream? And this feeling is incredibly, almost overwhelmingly compelling. When you decide to raise your hand right now, there's an unmistakable sense that you initiated that action. You feel the intention form in your mind, a conscious desire emerges, and then your hand moves. Cause and effect, clear as day, right? This is why philosophers throughout history have defended free will so vigorously. From Aristotle to Kant, from Descartes to modern libertarian philosophers, the argument has been elegantly simple. We feel ourselves making choices. We have direct, first-person access to our own decision-making process. Therefore, we must have free will. How could we be so wrong about something we experience so intimately? Immanuel Kant argued that free will was a necessary presupposition of moral responsibility. If we're going to hold people accountable for their actions, if we're going to have systems of justice and punishment, then people must be free to choose between right and wrong. Without free will, the entire edifice of morality collapses. René Descartes, with his famous, "I think, therefore I am," placed consciousness and the thinking self at the center of existence. The self that thinks is the self that chooses, and that choosing self has a kind of sovereignty over its own decisions. Even modern philosophers like Robert Caine have developed sophisticated accounts of libertarian free will, arguing that there are moments of genuine indeterminacy in our decision-making, moments where the universe could genuinely go either way, and it's our conscious self that tips the scales. And in our everyday lives, we operate entirely on the assumption that we have free will. Our legal systems are built on it. When someone commits a crime, we ask, did they choose to do it? Were they in their right mind? Could they have done otherwise? If the answer is yes, we hold them responsible. If the answer is no, if they were insane, coerced, or acting under duress, we mitigate their punishment. Our personal relationships are built on it too. We get angry at people for their choices. We praise them for good decisions. We say things like, "You could have tried harder," or "You should have known better." All of this assumes that people are free agents, capable of doing otherwise than they did. The feeling of free will is so strong that even people who intellectually doubt its existence still feel like they have it. Sam Harris, a neuroscientist and philosopher who's written extensively about the illusion of free will, admits that he still experiences the feeling of making choices, even though he's convinced it's an illusion. But here's where things get interesting, where the foundation starts to crack. What if that feeling of choice, that sense of conscious decision-making that seems so self-evident, is actually a trick your brain plays on you after the decision has already been made? What if your brain chose the salad before you were aware of choosing it, and then generated the feeling of conscious choice, the internal narrative of deliberation, to make sense of what had already happened unconsciously? What if the experience of you deciding is actually your brain watching itself decide and then taking credit for it? The subconscious puppet master, when your brain decides without you. Let's talk about some experiments that fundamentally changed how neuroscientists think about decision-making and conscious will. In 1983, neuroscientist Benjamin Libet conducted what would become one of the most famous and controversial experiments in the history of neuroscience, an experiment that would fundamentally challenge our understanding of free will and spark debates that continue to this day. Libet asked participants to perform a simple task: flex their wrist whenever they felt the urge, but to do so spontaneously whenever the impulse struck them. There was no external cue, no prompt, just the internal feeling of wanting to move. While they did this, Libet monitored their brain activity using EEG electrodes on their scalp. But here's the crucial part. The subjects were also asked to watch a clock with a rapidly moving dot and note the exact position of the dot at the moment they felt the conscious intention to move. This gave Libet a precise timestamp for when the conscious decision entered awareness. Here's what Libet discovered, and it's genuinely shocking if you think about it carefully. The brain showed activity, called the readiness potential or Berechaft's potential, about 550 milliseconds, more than half a second, before the person moved their wrist. This makes sense. The brain needs to prepare the motor cortex, send signals down the spinal cord, activate the muscles. No surprise there. But get this, the conscious intention to move, the moment when subjects reported feeling the urge to flex their wrist, only appeared about 200 milliseconds before the action. Let that sink in. The brain was preparing to act a full 350 milliseconds, more than a third of a second, before the person was consciously aware of deciding to act. In other words, your brain starts the process of making a decision before you, the conscious, aware you, even knows a decision is being made. The subjective experience of consciously willing an action comes after the brain has already initiated that action. Libet himself was troubled by this finding. He proposed that while we might not have free will, we might have free won't, the ability to veto actions at the last moment. But subsequent research has cast doubt even on this consolation. More recent studies have pushed this timeline even further and addressed many of the criticisms of Libet's original work. In 2008, Neuroscientist John Dylan Haynes and his team at the Max Planck Institute used fMRI brain scans, which can measure activity in deeper brain structures, and found something even more remarkable. They could predict participants' decisions up to 7 seconds before the participants consciously felt they'd made a choice. 7 seconds. That's an eternity in neuroscience terms. That's enough time to have entire conversations, to think multiple thoughts, to feel like you're actively deliberating. In the Haynes experiment, participants were asked to make a simple choice. Press a button with their left hand or their right hand whenever they felt like it. They also had to remember what letter was showing on a screen at the moment they felt they'd made their decision. By analyzing patterns of brain activity in the prefrontal and parietal cortex, Haynes could predict with 60% accuracy, well above chance, which button the person would press, a full 7 seconds before they reported making the decision. Think about what this means. There are patterns of neural activity, signatures in your brain, that predict your choices long before you experience making them. These patterns are there, reliably predicting your behavior, while you're sitting there feeling like you're in the process of freely choosing. And it's not just simple motor actions. Similar findings have been replicated with more complex decisions. When people are choosing between different abstract options, neural activity predictive of their choice appears before conscious awareness. But let's go even deeper. Consider how much of your behavior is driven by processes you're completely, totally unaware of, processes that are shaping your choices without your permission or knowledge. Priming effects are everywhere, and they're genuinely unsettling when you understand their power. In one classic study, researchers exposed participants to words related to old age, words like wrinkled, gray, retired, embedded in a supposedly unrelated word puzzle. After completing the puzzle, participants walked more slowly down the hallway than the control group. They weren't consciously thinking about old age. They didn't decide to walk slowly. The mere exposure to those words unconsciously activated concepts associated with elderly people. And this activation influenced their motor behavior without any awareness that this was happening. In another study, students held either a cup of hot coffee or iced coffee for a few moments, supposedly while the experimenter wrote something down. Then they read a description of a person and were asked to evaluate their personality. Those who held the warm beverage rated the person as having a warmer, more generous personality. Those who held the cold beverage rated them as colder and more self-centered. The participants had no idea that holding a beverage influenced their judgments. They thought they were making objective assessments, but the physical sensation of warmth or coldness unconsciously primed concepts of interpersonal warmth or coldness, shaping their evaluations. There are thousands of these priming studies, and they show the same disturbing pattern. Subtle environmental cues that we don't consciously register are constantly influencing our behavior, our judgments, our choices. Implicit biases are another massive category of unconscious influence that shapes our decisions in ways that often contradict our conscious values. Your brain makes snap judgments about people based on race, gender, age, weight, attractiveness, accent, and appearance in milliseconds, often within 100 milliseconds of seeing someone. These aren't conscious choices. They're automatic responses to patterns learned over a lifetime of exposure to media, culture, and social interactions. The implicit association test, developed by psychologists Anthony Greenwald and Mazarin Banerjee, has demonstrated that even people who consciously reject prejudice and sincerely believe in equality often harbor unconscious biases. These biases predict real-world behavior: who gets hired, who gets promoted, who receives medical treatment, who gets stopped by police. You don't choose these reactions. You can't simply decide not to have them. They emerge from associative networks in your brain that formed automatically, often contrary to your explicit beliefs. And they influence your behavior in ways you're completely unaware of, unless you take special measures to counteract them. Habit formation represents yet another way your brain operates on autopilot. Researchers estimate that 40–50% of our daily actions are habits, not conscious decisions. Your brain creates automatic pathways through a process called chunking, where sequences of actions get compressed into single routines that run without conscious oversight. You don't consciously decide to brush your teeth in the morning, decide where to place the toothbrush, how much toothpaste to use, which teeth to brush first. You just do it. The entire sequence has been automated. Your conscious mind is free to think about your day ahead while your unconscious mind handles the actual behavior. Driving is another example. Remember when you first learned to drive? Every action required intense conscious attention, checking mirrors, adjusting speed, steering, signaling. Now, you can drive home on a familiar route while thinking about something completely different and arrive home barely remembering the drive. Your unconscious mind handled the entire task. This is efficient, but it also means that huge swaths of your behavior are determined by automatic processes, not conscious choice. And here's something that really drives the point home. Your conscious mind processes about 120 bits of information per second. That sounds like a lot, until you learn that your unconscious mind processes approximately 11 million bits of information per second. Your consciousness is handling about 0.001% of your brain's total processing. It's not the command center. It's not the executive making all the decisions. It's more like a public relations officer crafting narratives about decisions that have already been made by processes you can't access. The neuroscientist David Eagleman puts it brilliantly. You are not a single entity making unified choices. You're a massive collection of competing neural systems, most of which are completely inaccessible to your conscious awareness, and your consciousness is just one part of that system, not necessarily the most important part. Brain architecture and predetermination, the biology of choice. Now let's talk about why your brain makes the choices it does, because this is where the illusion really starts to crack open, and we confront the deep biological constraints on what we call free will. Your brain isn't a blank slate, ready to freely choose any possibility that comes before it. It's a physical organ, the product of your unique genetic code, your developmental environment, and every experience you've ever had. And this architecture, this particular configuration of neurons, synapses, and chemical systems, fundamentally shapes what you will choose before you even encounter a decision. Let's start with genetics. Twin studies, which compare identical twins, who share 100% of their DNA, with fraternal twins, who share 50%, provide powerful evidence that genetics influences virtually everything about who we are and what we do. Political orientation. Twin studies suggest that 40–60% of the variance in political attitudes is heritable. Whether you lean conservative or liberal isn't purely a product of reasoned choice or environmental influence. It's substantially influenced by your genes. Risk-taking behavior, openness to new experiences, tendency toward addiction, impulsivity, empathy, aggression, all of these traits that profoundly influence your choices have significant genetic components. Your genes influence your brain's structure from the very beginning. They determine how many neurons you have in different regions, how densely those neurons are packed, how they're connected. They influence your neurotransmitter systems, how much dopamine, serotonin, norepinephrine your brain produces, how sensitive your receptors are to these chemicals, how efficiently they're cleared from synapses. These aren't abstract factors. They directly impact what you'll find rewarding, what you'll find aversive, how much pleasure you get from social interaction versus solitude, whether you're naturally anxious or calm, whether you're drawn to novelty or prefer routine. People with certain variants of the DRD4 gene, which affects dopamine receptors, are more likely to be sensation seekers, to take risks, to try new things. They didn't choose to have this gene variant. They didn't choose to find risk-taking more rewarding. But this genetic factor is influencing their choices every single day. You didn't choose your genes. Your parents' particular combination of genetic material randomly came together at conception, and that lottery determined fundamental aspects of your personality, your predispositions, your tendencies. Yet these genetic factors are influencing every choice you make. Early experiences are equally powerful in shaping the architecture of your brain. Your childhood literally wires your neural circuits. The experiences you have from birth through adolescence shape which neural connections get strengthened and which get pruned away, a process called experience-dependent plasticity. Children who experience trauma, abuse, or neglect develop different neural pathways than those who grow up in secure, nurturing environments. The amygdala, involved in fear and threat detection, tends to be hyperactive in children with adverse childhood experiences. The prefrontal cortex, involved in impulse control and rational decision-making, often shows altered development. These aren't just temporary effects. They create lasting changes in brain architecture that shape how you perceive threats, how you regulate emotions, how you form relationships, how you respond to stress, all factors that profoundly influence your behavior and choices. Attachment patterns formed in the first few years of life predict relationship behaviors decades later. Children who develop anxious attachment because their caregivers were inconsistent don't choose to feel anxious in relationships as adults. They're operating based on neural pathways formed before they had any meaningful autonomy. The Romanian orphans who experienced severe deprivation in infancy showed profound changes in brain development. Smaller brain volumes, altered white matter, disrupted neural circuits. These children often struggled with impulsivity, emotional regulation, and social relationships throughout their lives. Did they choose to have brains shaped by deprivation? Of course not. But those brain differences determined their behavioral tendencies. And it's not just extreme cases. Even in normal development, your particular upbringing, your parents' parenting style, your siblings, your socioeconomic status, your education, your cultural context, all of this literally shapes your brain during critical developmental periods, creating predispositions towards certain thoughts, feelings, and behaviors. Did you choose your childhood? Did you choose your parents? Did you choose the neighborhood you grew up in, the school you attended, the experiences you had during the critical periods when your brain was being wired? No, but all of these factors are choosing for you now, every time you make a decision. Then there's neurochemistry, the chemical orchestra that's playing in your brain at every moment. Your levels of dopamine, serotonin, norepinephrine, cortisol, oxytocin, and dozens of other neurotransmitters and hormones profoundly affect your mood, your motivation, your decision-making, and your behavior. Dopamine is often called the reward chemical, though that's a simplification. It's involved in motivation, pleasure, learning, and the valuation of potential rewards. People with naturally higher dopamine sensitivity are more prone to seeking rewards, taking risks, pursuing novelty. They're also more vulnerable to addiction. People with lower dopamine activity are more prone to depression, lack of motivation, and anhedonia, the inability to feel pleasure. When you choose to pursue a goal, dopamine is involved in making that goal feel worth pursuing. When you choose to take a risk, dopamine is involved in making that risk feel exciting rather than terrifying. But you didn't choose your baseline dopamine levels. You didn't choose how sensitive your dopamine receptors are. Serotonin is involved in mood regulation, impulse control, and social behavior. Low serotonin is linked to depression, impulsivity, and aggression. SSRIs, the most common antidepressants, work by increasing serotonin availability. When someone's depression lifts on SSRIs, they start making different choices. Getting out of bed, socializing, pursuing activities. Did their free will increase? Or did changing their brain chemistry change the decisions their brain generates? And these chemical balances fluctuate constantly based on factors largely outside your control. How much sleep you got last night, what you ate, your stress levels, whether you exercised, whether you're fighting off an infection, your hormonal cycle if you menstruate, even the season and how much sunlight you're exposed to. Studies show that judges are more likely to grant parole after a meal break than before. Presumably, these judges believe they're making rational, impartial decisions based on the facts of each case. But their choices are being influenced by blood sugar levels and decision fatigue. They're not aware of this influence. They don't choose to be harsher before lunch, but they are. Now let's consider some of the most dramatic examples. Cases where brain changes directly cause personality and behavior changes. The tragic case of Charles Whitman is one of the most striking examples. In 1966, Whitman killed his wife and mother, then went to the University of Texas Tower and shot 46 people, killing 16 of them. It was one of the first mass shootings in modern American history. But here's what makes this case especially relevant to our discussion. Whitman knew something was wrong with him. He'd written in his journal about experiencing unusual and irrational thoughts and feeling like something was overriding his normal self. He even wrote a note asking for an autopsy after his death. That autopsy revealed a tumor pressing against his amygdala, the brain's fear and aggression center. Neuroscientists believe this tumor was affecting his ability to regulate violent impulses. Did Charles Whitman choose to become a mass murderer? In one sense, his body performed those actions. But did the person he was before the tumor would have made those choices? The tumor changed his brain, which changed who he was, which changed what he chose to do. Or consider cases of frontotemporal dementia, a neurodegenerative disease that affects the frontal and temporal lobes, regions involved in personality, social behavior, and impulse control. People with frontotemporal dementia often undergo radical personality changes. A responsible, moral person might suddenly start stealing, gambling compulsively, or making inappropriate sexual advances. They lose empathy, violate social norms, and engage in behaviors completely out of character for their previous selves. From the outside, it looks like they're choosing to behave badly. From the inside, they don't feel like they've changed at all. They lack the self-awareness to recognize their own transformation. But we understand that it's not a choice. Their frontal lobes, which govern impulse control, social judgment, and moral reasoning, are degenerating. They're not choosing to become different people. Their damaged brains are generating different behaviors. There's a documented case of a 40-year-old man who suddenly developed an obsession with child pornography. He'd never shown any such interests before, but suddenly he was compulsively collecting illegal images. He was convicted and sent to treatment. While in treatment, he began experiencing headaches and balance problems. An MRI revealed a large brain tumor in his orbitofrontal cortex, a region involved in impulse control and social behavior. The tumor was removed, and his obsession with child pornography vanished. A year later, the obsession returned. Another MRI revealed the tumor had grown back. It was removed again, and again the obsession disappeared. This is a disturbing case, but it's philosophically crucial. Were this man's actions freely chosen? His behavior was completely determined by whether he had a tumor pressing on specific brain regions. Remove the tumor, remove the behavior. The tumor returns, the behavior returns. If a brain tumor can completely determine what you choose to desire and pursue, then how much of your current desires and choices are just the result of your particular brain configuration? A configuration you didn't choose and can't directly control. Let's extend this logic. If brain damage can change who you are and what you choose, then the brain you have right now, intact and functional, is still determining who you are and what you choose. You just can't see it as clearly because you don't have a before and after comparison. Your brain's structure, shaped by genes you didn't choose and experiences you didn't choose, operating with neurochemical balances you didn't choose, is generating thoughts, desires, and behaviors that feel like your choices. But there's an unbroken chain of causation leading to every decision you make, a chain that stretches back before you were born, before you had any say in the matter. Where in this causal chain does free will enter? Where does the buck stop? Where do you get to step outside of physical causation and make a truly free choice unconstrained by your biology, your history, your current brain state? The illusion of control, cognitive biases, and social influence. Even when we think we're making rational, conscious, free choices, even when we sit down to carefully deliberate about an important decision, our brains are running invisible programs, automatic algorithms that steer us in predetermined directions without our awareness or consent. Let's explore the vast landscape of cognitive biases, the systematic errors in thinking that affect everyone, even people who study these biases for a living. Confirmation bias is perhaps the most pervasive and powerful bias we face. Once you form a belief, your brain selectively notices evidence that confirms it while ignoring, dismissing, or forgetting contradictory information. You think you're objectively evaluating facts, updating your beliefs based on evidence, making rational choices. But your brain has already chosen its conclusion and is now cherry-picking the data to support it. This isn't a conscious choice. You're not deliberately ignoring contradictory evidence. It's an automatic filter operating below awareness. Information that confirms your existing beliefs feels more credible, more memorable, more important. Information that contradicts your beliefs feels suspect, irrelevant, or easily explained away. Studies show that when people with strong political beliefs are presented with scientific evidence that contradicts their views, they don't update their beliefs. They actually become more entrenched in their original position. The contradictory evidence activates defensive reasoning, and they generate explanations for why the evidence is flawed, biased, or misinterpreted. Were they choosing to be irrational? Were they consciously deciding to reject valid evidence? No. Their brains were automatically protecting existing belief structures, and their conscious minds were generating justifications after the fact. Anchoring is another bias that demonstrates how much our choices are influenced by arbitrary factors we're not aware of. The first number you encounter in a negotiation, a purchase, or any estimation task disproportionately influences your final decision, even when that number is completely random and known to be arbitrary. In one famous experiment, psychologists Tversky and Kahneman asked people to spin a wheel numbered 1/100, rigged to land on either 10 or 65. Then they asked, "What percentage of African nations are in the United Nations?" People who saw 10 on the wheel guessed an average of 25%. People who saw 65 guessed an average of 45%. A completely random number, with no connection to the question, dramatically influenced their estimates. In another study, people were asked to write down the last 2 digits of their social security number, then bid on items in an auction. Those with higher numbers bid significantly more. Your social security number, which has zero relationship to the value of any item, influenced how much you were willing to pay. Real-world implications. The first salary number mentioned in a negotiation sets the anchor for the entire conversation. The first price you see for a house, even if it's wildly inflated, affects how much you think the house is worth. Your free choice of what to offer is being manipulated by initial numbers you had no control over encountering. The availability heuristic is a mental shortcut where we judge the likelihood of events based on how easily examples come to mind, not on actual statistical frequency. Plane crashes are memorable and dramatic, so they're easy to recall. Car accidents are common but individually forgettable. Result: people overestimate the danger of flying and underestimate the danger of driving, even though driving is far more dangerous per mile traveled. Terrorism, shark attacks, stranger abductions, all dramatically overestimated because they're vivid and media-saturated. Heart disease, diabetes, medical errors, underestimated because they're mundane and less memorable. This heuristic influences countless choices. You choose to drive instead of fly because flying feels more dangerous. You choose to worry about stranger danger instead of teaching your kids about abuse from people they know, because stranger danger is more available in memory. You weren't consciously choosing to be irrational. Your brain was using a mental shortcut that evolved in environments very different from the modern world. The halo effect shows how one positive trait influences our judgment of other, unrelated traits. Attractive people are judged as more intelligent, more competent, more trustworthy. There's no logical connection between physical attractiveness and these qualities, but the halo of attractiveness spreads to other judgments. When you're hearing, voting, or choosing whose advice to follow, you think you're evaluating people's actual qualifications. but their physical appearance is unconsciously influencing your judgment. In one study, identical essays received different grades when professors believed they were written by attractive versus unattractive students, based on photos attached to the essays. The professors weren't consciously choosing to discriminate. They genuinely believed they were grading the content, but the halo effect was operating below awareness. Loss aversion means we feel the pain of losing something more intensely than the pleasure of gaining something of equal value. People will take greater risks to avoid losses than to achieve equivalent gains. They'll hold on to losing investments longer than they should, hopping to avoid realizing the loss, and sell winning investments too early, eager to lock in the gain. This isn't a rational choice. It's an asymmetry in how our brains process gains versus losses. This affects everything from financial decisions to relationship choices to career moves. The fear of losing what you have keeps you in situations you'd never choose to enter if you were starting fresh. But you don't feel like fear is making your choices. You generate rational-sounding reasons for staying put. But here's perhaps the most profound bias, the one that most directly relates to the illusion of free will, the narrative fallacy and confabulation. After you make a decision, your brain constructs a coherent story about why you made that choice. It needs to make sense of your behavior, to create a unified narrative of a rational, consistent self making purposeful choices. So it weaves together a compelling story, selecting facts that fit the narrative and ignoring those that don't. And here's the crucial part. This story is constructed after the fact. It's a post hoc rationalization, not a description of the actual decision-making process. You chose the salad because you're health-conscious and care about nutrition. You chose your college major because you're passionate about the subject. You chose your career because it aligns with your values. You chose your partner because of their personality, their sense of humor, their intelligence. In reality, your brain made those decisions based on countless factors, some conscious, most unconscious. But the story you tell yourself about why you made those choices, that's your brain's public relations department, creating a coherent narrative of a rational agent making free choices based on clear reasons. Split-brain patients provide the most striking evidence of this confabulation. In split-brain patients, the connection between the brain's hemispheres has been severed to treat severe epilepsy. This allows researchers to present information to one hemisphere without the other hemisphere knowing about it. In one classic experiment, researchers showed the word walk to the right hemisphere only, which controls the left side of the body and doesn't have language in most people. The patient stood up and started walking. When asked why they were walking, the patient's left hemisphere, which has language but didn't see the instruction, immediately confabulated a reason. I'm going to get a Coke. The left hemisphere didn't know why the body was walking. It didn't receive the instruction. But it couldn't tolerate not knowing, so it instantly invented a plausible explanation. And the patient genuinely believed this explanation. They weren't lying. Their brain was automatically generating a narrative to explain behavior it didn't actually understand. We're all doing this, all the time. When you ask people why they made a choice, they're essentially confabulating, creating plausible stories that may have nothing to do with the actual causes of their behavior. In studies where researchers manipulate people's choices using priming or framing effects, the people never identify the real cause. Instead, they generate compelling-sounding reasons that have nothing to do with what actually influenced them. I chose this brand because it's higher quality. No, you chose it because the package was placed at eye level. I voted for this candidate because of their policy positions. No, you voted for them because you liked their voice and facial expressions. And crucially, when you construct these post hoc narratives, you experience them as true. They feel like accurate descriptions of your decision-making process. This reinforces the illusion of conscious, rational choice. Now let's talk about social influence, because you're not a free agent making isolated choices in a vacuum. You're a node in a vast network of social and cultural influences. Conformity studies, starting with Solomon Ash's famous line judgment experiments, show that people will deny the evidence of their own senses to conform to group opinion. When Confederates in a study unanimously gave obviously wrong answers about which lines were the same length, about 75% of participants conformed at least once, giving answers they knew were wrong just to match the group. Were they freely choosing to lie? Many reported genuine uncertainty. The group's unanimous opinion made them doubt their own perception. Social pressure reshaped their conscious experience. Stanley Milgram's obedience studies showed that ordinary people would administer what they believed were dangerous electric shocks to innocent victims simply because an authority figure told them to. About 65% went all the way to the maximum shock level. Were they freely choosing to harm someone? They were clearly distressed, uncomfortable, conflicted. But the situation's structure, the authority figure, the gradual escalation, the diffusion of responsibility, determined their behavior more powerfully than their individual choice, not to harm others. Your opinions, your preferences, your values, all of these feel like your own, freely chosen. But research consistently shows that we unconsciously adopt the attitudes of people around us, mimic their behaviors, conform to group norms, and make choices that gain social approval, all while believing we're acting independently based on our own judgment. The clothes you wear, the music you like, the political views you hold, the foods you consider normal, the career you think is respectable, the way you express emotions, the distance you stand from people when talking, all of these are profoundly shaped by your culture and social environment. You didn't choose which culture to be born into. You didn't choose your native language, which literally shapes how you think. You didn't choose the historical moment you exist in, which determines which ideas are available for you to consider. You're not a free agent making isolated choices. You're embedded in layers of social influence that shape your desires and decisions from the moment you're born. The illusion of authorship. Who is the I that chooses? Let's step back and ask a more fundamental question. When you say, I chose, who exactly is this I? We have a strong intuition that there's a unified self, a central command center, a soul or essence that constitutes the real you. This entity surveys options, weighs them carefully, and makes decisions. It's the ghost in the machine, the pilot in the cockpit, the homunculus sitting in a control room watching screens and pulling levers. But neuroscience reveals a very different picture. Your brain isn't unified. It's a collection of many different systems, often with conflicting goals, competing for control of your behavior. There's no central command center where you sit and make decisions. The neuroscientist Michael Gazzaniga, who studied split-brain patients extensively, describes the brain as a collection of modules, each specialized for different functions. There's a face recognition module, a language module, a spatial reasoning module, an emotional processing module, and so on. These modules operate largely independently, unconsciously, automatically. What we experience as consciousness, as the unified I, Gazzaniga argues, is generated by what he calls the interpreter, a function of the left hemisphere that constructs coherent narratives from the outputs of all these different modules. But the interpreter isn't in charge. It's more like a spin doctor or press secretary, creating stories that explain what the brain has already done. It gives you the feeling that there's a coherent self making unified choices, but this feeling is an illusion constructed from disparate neural processes. Consider what happens when these systems conflict. You decide to diet, but then you find yourself eating cookies. Did you change your mind? Or were different neural systems, one valuing long-term health, one responding to immediate reward in competition, and the reward system won in that moment? You decide to stop checking your phone, but then your hand reaches for it automatically. You decide to go to bed early, but you find yourself watching another episode. You decide to save money, but you make an impulsive purchase. These aren't failures of willpower, exactly. They're demonstrations that there isn't a single you making choices. There are multiple systems within your brain with different goals and different time horizons, and which system dominates in any given moment depends on factors like stress, fatigue, hunger, proximity to temptation. factors you don't consciously control. The psychologist Daniel Kahneman describes two systems of thinking. System 1, which is fast, automatic, unconscious, and emotional, and System 2, which is slow, deliberate, conscious, and rational. We like to think of ourselves as System 2, the rational, conscious decision maker. But System 1 is doing most of the work, most of the time. System 2 mostly serves to rationalize and approve decisions that System 1 has already made. And here's something even more unsettling. The experience of being a unified self persists through time is itself somewhat illusory. You remember being the same person you were 10 years ago. You feel continuous identity with your past self and your future self. But are you really the same person? Your cells have almost entirely been replaced. Your memories have been reconstructed and altered. Your personality has shifted. Your values may have changed. Your brain's physical structure is different. The philosopher Derek Parfit argued that personal identity is less like being a single entity persisting through time and more like a series of overlapping psychological connections. The you that exists right now is connected to the you of yesterday through memory and psychological continuity. But there's no essential, unchanging core self. If that's true, then who exactly is this I that's supposed to be making free choices? Is it the you of this instant, the you averaged over your lifetime, the you that will exist in the future and will judge today's choices? Buddhist philosophy has long challenged the notion of a fixed, unchanging self. The concept of anatta, or non-self, suggests that what we call the self is actually a constantly changing process, not a fixed entity. There's no unchanging essence that's you. Modern neuroscience is converging on a similar view. You're not a thing, a unified entity. You're a process, a constantly shifting pattern of neural activity, a verb more than a noun. And if there's no stable I to be found, then who exactly is exercising free will? The determinism debate, physics, quantum mechanics, and causation. Let's zoom out even further and think about the physical universe itself. Classical physics, from Newton through Einstein, described a deterministic universe. Given the complete state of the universe at one moment, every particle's position and momentum, the laws of physics would allow you to calculate the entire future and past. The universe is like a clock, wound up at the beginning, ticking forward according to inexorable physical laws. In such a universe, where does free will fit in? Your brain is made of particles following physical laws. Every thought, every decision, every behavior is the result of physical processes. Neurons firing, neurotransmitters binding to receptors, electrical signals propagating down axons. And those physical processes have causes. The neurotransmitter was released because of electrical signals from other neurons. Those electrical signals had prior causes. Those causes had causes. You can trace the causal chain back, through your childhood experiences, through your genetic inheritance, through your parents' genetics and experiences, through evolution, through the formation of Earth, through the Big Bang. There's an unbroken chain of physical causation leading to every thought in your head right now. Where in that chain do you get to step in and make a free choice unconstrained by prior causes? Some people pin their hopes on quantum mechanics. Quantum mechanics introduces genuine randomness into physics. At the quantum level, certain events, like the exact moment a radioactive atom decays, are truly random, not determined by prior causes. Could quantum randomness in the brain be the source of free will? Most neuroscientists are skeptical. First, quantum effects are typically relevant only at extremely small scales and low temperatures. The brain is hot and wet, and quantum effects tend to be washed out by thermal noise at biological scales. Second, and more importantly, randomness isn't the same as free will. If your decisions are influenced by random quantum fluctuations, that doesn't make them free, it makes them random. You still didn't choose them. They just happened by chance rather than being determined by prior causes. Genuine free will would require something beyond both determinism and randomness. It would require some capacity to be a first cause. to make choices that aren't fully determined by prior physical states, but also aren't just random. But what would that even mean? How could something be neither determined by prior causes nor random? The philosopher Galen Strawson argues that true moral responsibility, and thus free will, is logically impossible. His argument goes like this. You do what you do because of the way you are. To be truly responsible for what you do, you'd have to be responsible for the way you are. To be responsible for the way you are, you'd have to have chosen to become that way. But to choose to become a certain way, you'd already have to be a certain way to make that choice. This leads to an infinite regress. You'd have to have chosen your initial self, but there is no initial self that you chose. Your initial self was created by factors outside your control, genes, early environment, chance. Therefore, you can't be truly responsible for the way you are, and thus you can't be truly responsible for what you do. This argument applies regardless of whether the universe is deterministic or has quantum randomness. Either way, the buck never stops with you as an uncaused causer. CUMPT BLSM, RDFNNG free will. At this point, you might be thinking, okay, you've convinced me. Free will doesn't exist in the way I thought it did, but we still use the concept. We still need to distinguish between someone who commits a crime because they're mentally ill versus someone who does it intentionally. We still make decisions and feel like we're choosing. How do we make sense of all this? This is where compatibilism enters the picture. Compatibilism is the philosophical view that free will and determinism are compatible. Yes, the universe might be deterministic. Yes, your choices might be fully caused by prior events, but you can still have free will if we define it correctly. The key is to stop thinking of free will as some magical ability to transcend causation, and instead think of it as a practical distinction between different kinds of causes. According to compatibilists like Daniel Dennett, a choice is free if it stems from your own desires, beliefs, and values, not from external coercion. You could have done otherwise if you had wanted to. Your decision-making process is functioning normally. You're not insane, drugged, or under duress. In this view, the opposite of free isn't determined. It's coerced or constrained. If someone puts a gun to your head and demands your wallet, that's not a free choice. Not because it's determined by prior causes, all choices are, but because it's coerced by an external threat. If you choose to give money to charity because you value helping others, that is a free choice, not because it's uncaused. It's caused by your values, which were shaped by your upbringing and experiences, but because it flows from your own internal states rather than external compulsion. Compatibilists argue this is the only coherent definition of free. Well, that's worth wanting. The libertarian free will, the ability to make choices completely unconstrained by prior causes, is not only impossible, but also incoherent and undesirable. If your choices weren't caused by your desires, values, and character, they'd be random. Would you want your important life decisions to be random? Of course not. You want them to be based on who you are, what you value, what you care about. But that means they're determined by your internal states, which were themselves shaped by factors ultimately outside your control. Daniel Dennett uses the metaphor of the kind of control worth wanting. Yes, you don't have ultimate, contra-causal control over your decisions, but you have a kind of control that's practically important. Your decisions flow from your own deliberation, your own values, your own character. Sam Harris, a prominent critic of free will, argues against compatibilism. He says compatibilists are just redefining free will to mean something it was never meant to mean. When ordinary people say they have free will, they mean they could have genuinely done otherwise in exactly the same circumstances. They mean there's a they that stands apart from the causal chain and makes decisions. That's the free will people care about, and that free will doesn't exist. Harris argues that recognizing the illusion of free will has profound practical and moral implications, and compatibilists are obscuring these implications by playing word games. Who's right? That depends partly on what you think the concept of free will is for, what work it needs to do in our moral and practical lives. But perhaps more important than this philosophical debate is understanding what actually happens in your brain when you make decisions, and what that means for how you live your life. The neuroscience of decision-making, a deeper dive. Let's explore in more detail the actual mechanisms your brain uses when you're faced with a choice. When you're making a decision, let's say choosing between two job offers, multiple brain systems are active simultaneously. The prefrontal cortex, particularly the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex, is involved in working memory and holding multiple options in mind. It's manipulating information, comparing alternatives, thinking through consequences. The anterior cingulate cortex is detecting conflict between options and signaling when there's a difficult decision to be made. It's the source of that uncomfortable feeling when you're torn between alternatives. The orbitofrontal cortex and ventromedial prefrontal cortex are assigning values to different options based on expected outcomes. They're integrating emotional information with rational analysis. The amygdala and other limbic structures are processing emotional significance. How do you feel about each option? What emotions do you associate with them? The striatum, part of the basal ganglia, is involved in reward processing and habit learning. It's being influenced by dopamine, which is signaling the potential reward value of each option. The insula is processing interoceptive information, signals from your body about your gut feelings, your physiological state. All of these systems are processing simultaneously, largely unconsciously. They're being influenced by your current physiological state, hungry, tired, stressed, by recent experiences, by long-term memories, by emotional associations, by social context. Eventually, one option reaches a threshold of activation, and that's the choice that gets made. The conscious experience of deciding may come at or after this threshold is reached, not before. Antonio Damasio's research on patients with damage to the ventromedial prefrontal cortex revealed something surprising. These patients could reason logically, had normal intelligence, could analyze the pros and cons of decisions, but they struggled to make decisions in everyday life. Why? Because they lack the emotional gut feelings that normally guide decision-making. Damasio's somatic marker hypothesis proposes that emotions and bodily states are integral to decision-making, not opposed to rational thought. When you're making a choice, your brain is generating subtle emotional reactions to each option, positive feelings toward some, negative feelings toward others. These emotional reactions, based on past experiences and learned associations, help guide your rational deliberation. Patients without these emotional signals can analyze forever, but can't settle on a choice. They lack the intuitive sense of which option feels right. This reveals something important. Rational deliberation doesn't work on its own. It needs to be guided by unconscious emotional processes that are themselves products of learning and past experience. So when you make a decision, you're not a pure rational agent dispassionately weighing evidence. You're an embodied creature whose rational thoughts are constantly being shaped by emotional reactions you're barely aware of, reactions that emerged from neural learning processes you didn't consciously control. Moral responsibility without free will. If free will is an illusion, what happens to moral responsibility, to praise and blame, to our entire system of justice? This is perhaps the most troubling implication for most people. We have a deep intuition that people should be held accountable for their choices, that wrongdoers deserve punishment, that good people deserve praise. But if people don't really choose their actions, if every choice is the inevitable result of prior causes, then how can we hold anyone responsible? Let's think this through carefully. First, consequentialist approaches to morality and justice don't actually require libertarian free will. We can justify punishment and incentives based on their consequences, not on metaphysical notions of desert. We punish criminals not because they deserve suffering for making freely chosen evil decisions, but because incarceration protects society from dangerous individuals. Punishment deters others from committing crimes. Rehabilitation can change people's future behavior. The threat of consequences shapes people's decision-making processes. All of these justifications work just fine in a deterministic universe. The fact that a criminal's brain state was caused by genetics and environment doesn't mean we can't intervene to change their future behavior or prevent them from harming others. In fact, understanding that behavior is caused by neurobiology and environment actually points toward more effective and humane approaches to justice. If someone commits a crime because of a brain tumor, we should remove the tumor, not torture them for being evil. If someone becomes violent because of childhood trauma and altered brain development, we should provide therapy and rehabilitation, not merely punishment. The retributive impulse, the desire to make people suffer because they deserve it, is what becomes questionable when you abandon free will. But forward-looking, consequentialist approaches to justice remain fully justified. Second, the practical distinction between intentional and unintentional actions remains important. Even without libertarian free will, there's a meaningful difference between someone who kills another person because of a psychotic delusion that they're a demon, someone who kills another person in a calculated plan to inherit their money. In the first case, the person's belief system is profoundly disconnected from reality. They couldn't respond to reason or moral argument. In the second case, the person understands what they're doing, knows it's wrong, but proceeds anyway. The first person needs treatment for psychosis. The second person's decision-making process needs to be influenced by the threat of consequences. This distinction doesn't require that the second person had libertarian free will. It just requires that their decision-making process was functioning in a way that can be influenced by incentives and rational deliberation. Third, praise and blame can be understood as social tools that shape behavior, not as metaphysical judgments about desert. When we praise someone for their accomplishments, we're reinforcing behaviors we want to encourage, giving them positive feedback that will influence their future choices, signaling to others what behaviors are valued. When we blame someone for wrongdoing, we're expressing disapproval that may change their future behavior, signaling to them and others that such behavior is unacceptable, creating social pressure that shapes decision-making. These social functions of praise and blame work just fine without libertarian free will. We can still say, "You shouldn't have done that," or "You made the right choice," as ways of influencing behavior, without believing the person had ultimate metaphysical control. The philosopher Dirk Perryboom has developed an account of moral responsibility without free will that he calls hard incompatibilism. Perryboom argues that libertarian free will doesn't exist. The kind of free will required for moral desert, deserving praise or blame, doesn't exist. But we can still have meaningful ethics, relationships, and criminal justice systems. His approach to criminal justice focuses entirely on protection and rehabilitation, not retribution. Society can quarantine dangerous individuals, just as we would quarantine people with highly contagious diseases, not because they're morally evil, but because they pose a threat. But we should do so in the most humane way possible, with the goal of rehabilitation when feasible, and without the additional suffering that comes from viewing punishment as deserved. Greg Carruth has similarly argued for a public health approach to criminal justice. Just as we address disease outbreaks through a public health framework, prevention, treatment, quarantine when necessary, we can address crime the same way. This involves addressing root causes: poverty, lack of education, childhood trauma, mental illness. Rehabilitation, focused on changing future behavior. Incapacitation of dangerous individuals when necessary, but in humane conditions. Recognition that criminal behavior is a symptom of biological and social factors, not pure evil choice. This approach is actually more effective at reducing crime than retributive justice, and it's more humane. It just requires giving up the emotionally satisfying but philosophically questionable notion that wrongdoers deserve to suffer. The phenomenology of choice, why the illusion persists. Given all this evidence that free will is an illusion, why does the feeling of freely choosing persist so strongly? The answer is that the illusion of free will is incredibly useful. It's an adaptive feature, not a bug. First, the feeling of agency, the sense that you're causing your actions, is necessary for learning and for predicting the consequences of your behavior. If you didn't feel like you were the cause of your actions, you couldn't learn from experience. When you touch a hot stove and feel pain, you learn to avoid hot stoves. This learning requires a sense that you touched the stove and you experience the consequence. The brain constructs a sense of agency to bind actions to outcomes, enabling learning. Second, the feeling that you could have done otherwise is necessary for deliberation. When you're faced with a choice, you need to simulate different possible futures. If I do A, then X will happen. If I do B, then Y will happen. This simulation process requires treating the different options as genuine possibilities. If you approached every decision already knowing what you were going to do, because it's determined, deliberation would be pointless. The feeling that you could choose either option makes deliberation feel meaningful and causes your brain to actually engage in the comparative process. So the feeling of free will isn't an accurate description of metaphysical reality. It's a useful fiction that enables effective decision-making. Third, the sense of having a unified self that persists through time and makes coherent choices is necessary for social interaction. Other people treat you as an agent responsible for your actions. You're expected to keep promises, honor commitments, maintain consistent values. The sense of being a unified self that makes choices allows you to function in social contexts that demand accountability. If you experienced yourself as a chaotic collection of competing neural processes with no coherent self, social interaction would become impossible. The philosopher Thomas Metzinger argues that the self is a phenomenal self-model, a simulation your brain constructs. You're not directly experiencing your real neural processes. You're experiencing a simplified model of yourself that your brain constructs for navigation and interaction. This model includes the feeling of being a unified agent with free will, even though that's not literally true of the underlying reality. It's similar to how your visual experience presents you with a seamless, continuous visual field. When in reality you have a blind spot where the optic nerve leaves your eye, you only see detail in the very center of your vision, and your eyes are constantly jumping around in rapid movements called saccades. Your brain fills in the gaps, creating the illusion of seamless, continuous vision. Similarly, your brain creates the illusion of a unified self with continuous control, when the reality is much more fragmented and automatic. But recognizing it's an illusion doesn't necessarily make it go away. Even after understanding all the neuroscience and philosophy, you'll still feel like you're making free choices. The phenomenology persists because it's generated by unconscious processes that aren't directly accessible to your conscious reasoning. This is like visual illusions. Even when you know the two lines are the same length, the Mueller-Lyer illusion still makes one look longer. Even when you know it's an illusion, you still see it. Similarly, even when you intellectually understand that free will is an illusion, you'll still feel yourself making choices. The question is whether this intellectual understanding changes how you think about yourself and others, how you approach decision-making, and how you structure society. Practical IMPLICTONS, living without free will. So what does all this mean for how you actually live your life? If free will is an illusion, does that mean nothing matters? Should you just give up on trying to make good choices? Should we abandon all sense of responsibility? Absolutely not. And here's why. Even though your choices are determined, they're still part of the causal process that shapes your future. Understanding influences gives you more power to shape outcomes, not less. When you recognize that your choices are influenced by fatigue, hunger, stress, cognitive biases, priming effects, and unconscious processes. You can structure your life to work with these influences rather than pretending they don't exist. Some practical applications. Recognize decision fatigue. Your ability to make good decisions depletes throughout the day as you make more choices. Important decisions should be made when you're fresh, not when you're depleted. Barack Obama famously wore only gray or blue suits to reduce decision fatigue. Mark Zuckerberg wears the same gray t-shirt. They're not being eccentric. They're recognizing that their brain's capacity for decision-making is limited, and they're conserving it for decisions that matter. Manage your environment. Your choices are heavily influenced by your immediate environment. If you want to eat healthier, remove junk food from your house. If you want to exercise more, put your gym clothes out the night before. If you want to read more, put books in places where you'd normally reach for your phone. You're not freely choosing to eat vegetables over chips in these scenarios. You're structuring your environment so that the easy, default choice is the one you want your brain to make. Practice implementation intentions. Instead of vague goals like, I'll exercise more, create specific if-then plans. If it's 6 a.m. on a weekday, then I'll put on my running shoes and run for 20 minutes. Research shows implementation intentions dramatically increase follow-through, not because they strengthen your willpower, but because they automate the decision-making process. When 6 a.m. arrives, your brain doesn't have to choose whether to exercise, it just executes the pre-planned behavior. Cultivate awareness of your mental state. Notice when you're hungry, tired, stressed, or emotional, and recognize that these states affect your judgment. Important decisions and difficult conversations should be postponed when you're in suboptimal states. This isn't about gaining free will. It's about adding self-awareness as another input into your brain's decision-making process. Question your immediate reactions. When you feel strong certainty about a belief or a strong impulse to act, pause and consider. What might be influencing this feeling? Am I experiencing confirmation bias, anchoring, an emotional reaction that's not relevant to the actual decision? This metacognitive awareness doesn't give you the ability to step outside causality, but it does change which causal processes influence your behavior. The brain that practices this kind of reflection will generate different outputs than the brain that doesn't. Practice compassion for yourself and others. This might be the most profound practical implication of understanding the illusion of free will. When you recognize that you didn't ultimately choose your genes, your upbringing, your brain chemistry, your circumstances, that you're a product of causes stretching back before your birth, it becomes harder to be harshly self-judgmental. You can still work to change your behavior, but you can do so with self-compassion rather than self-flagellation. You didn't choose to have addictive tendencies, to struggle with depression, to have an anxious temperament. These are products of biology and experience. You can work with your brain to change patterns, but you can do so while recognizing you didn't choose the starting conditions. And crucially, the same applies to other people. When someone behaves in ways you find frustrating or harmful, recognizing that their behavior is the product of their particular brain, shaped by factors they didn't control, makes it easier to respond with compassion rather than vindictive anger. This doesn't mean excusing harmful behavior or failing to set boundaries. You can still hold people accountable, insist on behavior change, remove yourself from harmful situations. But you can do so without the additional layer of moral condemnation that assumes they freely chose to be the way they are. Sam Harris describes this shift beautifully. When you truly internalize that free will is an illusion, other people's behavior becomes like weather. You can find weather inconvenient, you can take precautions against bad weather, but you don't take weather personally or feel like it deserves moral condemnation. It just is what it is, a product of causes. Similarly, when someone cuts you off in traffic or says something hurtful, you can recognize it's the product of their particular brain state at that moment. They're tired, stressed, socially unskilled, carrying past trauma. Their behavior is like weather. You can respond to it appropriately without the added suffering of taking it personally or needing them to be punished for being bad. This perspective can dramatically reduce suffering, both your own and others. Meditation, mindfulness, and the experience of no self. Buddhism has been exploring the illusory nature of the self and free will for millennia, long before modern neuroscience. The practice of mindfulness meditation involves paying close attention to your moment-to-moment experience, thoughts, sensations, emotions, without judgment and without identification. When you meditate, you start to notice something strange. Thoughts appear in consciousness without any sense of you thinking them. They just arise, like sounds arising in your ears. You'll be sitting quietly, and suddenly the thought, "I need to check my email," appears. You didn't consciously decide to think that thought. It just showed up. And then maybe another thought, "I should be focusing on my breath." Again, you didn't author that thought. It arose on its own. Emotions, too. A feeling of irritation arises. You didn't choose to feel irritated. The feeling appeared, caused by some combination of physical discomfort, mental association, brain chemistry. Even intentions, the sense of willing to do something, arise on their own. The intention to move your hand appears in consciousness, and then the hand moves. But the intention itself wasn't chosen. It emerged from unconscious processes. With sustained practice, meditators report experiencing the fundamental groundlessness of the self. There's awareness, there are experiences, but there's no stable, unchanging you having those experiences. Just a flow of mental events arising and passing. The Buddhist concept of anatta, non-self, describes this directly observed truth. What we call the self is not a thing, but a process. It's like a river. There's continuity and pattern, but no unchanging essence. The water molecules that constitute the river are constantly changing, yet we speak of the river as if it were a stable entity. Similarly, you are a process, not a thing. The cells that compose your body are constantly being replaced. The neural patterns that constitute your personality and memories are constantly being updated. There's psychological continuity, but no unchanging essence. And crucially, there's no unified controller, no homunculus pulling the levers. Just a collection of processes, giving rise to the experience of a unified self. An experience that's useful but ultimately illusory. Sam Harris, who practiced meditation extensively before his career in neuroscience and philosophy, argues that meditation is the most direct way to see through the illusion of the self and free will. It's not just an intellectual understanding. It's an experiential insight that can transform how you relate to your own thoughts and emotions. When you recognize that thoughts arise on their own, you stop identifying with them so strongly. When a self-critical thought appears, instead of thinking "I'm worthless," identifying the thought with truth about yourself, you can observe, there's a self-critical thought arising. It becomes just another mental event, not a fundamental truth about who you are. This creates space, freedom from the tyranny of your own thoughts. Not freedom in the sense of contra-causal free will, but freedom from being lost in thought, from believing every thought that appears, from identifying with your mental content. Many people find this perspective disturbing initially. If there's no unified self, no free will, then who am I? What's the point of anything? But long-term meditators and Buddhist practitioners often describe the opposite reaction: relief, liberation, peace. When you stop clinging to a fixed self that needs to be defended, maintained, perfected, there's a relaxation, an ease. You can be more present, more responsive to what's actually happening, less caught in narratives about yourself. You're not nothing. There are experiences, there is awareness, there is life unfolding. But you're not a separate, solid entity having those experiences. You are those experiences, moment by moment. RECLAMING agency in a determined world. A synthesis. We've covered a lot of ground. Let's bring it together. Free will, as most people intuitively understand it, the ability to make choices completely unconstrained by prior causes, the ability to have done otherwise in identical circumstances, almost certainly doesn't exist. The evidence from neuroscience, psychology, and physics all points in the same direction. But this doesn't mean you're helpless or that your choices don't matter. Your choices are part of the causal fabric of reality. They're caused by your brain state, which is caused by your genetics and experiences, which are caused by prior events stretching back to the beginning of time. But they still cause things. Your decisions still have real effects on your life and the world. The question isn't whether you have contracausal free will. The question is, given that you're a physical system operating according to natural laws, shaped by your particular history and biology, what kind of system do you want to be? You can be a system that operates mostly on autopilot, running unconscious programs without awareness. Or you can be a system that cultivates metacognitive awareness, that understands its own biases and limitations, that structures its environment intentionally, that practices reflection and mindfulness. Neither option is freely chosen in the ultimate sense, but the second option leads to better outcomes, more well-being, better decisions, less suffering. You don't need libertarian free will to have a meaningful life. Meaning comes from caring about things, from connections with others, from experiences of beauty and love and curiosity, from working toward goals that matter to you. None of that requires believing you have magical powers to transcend causation. In fact, understanding the illusory nature of the self and free will can deepen meaning. When you recognize how improbable and amazing it is that the universe gave rise to conscious beings capable of contemplating their own existence, when you see yourself as a brief, exquisite pattern of matter and energy experiencing itself, there's a profound wonder in that. You don't need libertarian free will to have morality. Morality can be grounded in reducing suffering and increasing well-being. These goals don't require people to have ultimate metaphysical control over their actions. They just require recognizing that conscious beings can suffer or flourish, and that our actions affect whether they do. We can still say some actions are better than others. Some people are more trustworthy than others. Some behaviors should be encouraged and others discouraged, all without believing in libertarian free will. You don't need libertarian free will to improve yourself. Even though your current self is the product of causes you didn't control, you can still be an active participant in shaping your future self. You can learn new skills, change your habits, restructure your environment, seek therapy, practice meditation, surround yourself with people who embody values you aspire to. All of these interventions add new causal factors that shape your brain's future outputs. You're not stepping outside the causal chain, but you're becoming a different kind of link in that chain. The philosopher Daniel Dennett argues that this is the kind of freedom worth wanting. Not freedom from causation, which would just be randomness, but freedom to be the kind of person you want to be, to have your actions flow from your own values and deliberation rather than from external coercion or internal compulsion. You don't need libertarian free will to have love and relationships. When you love someone, you're not loving their magical contracausal free will. You're loving the particular configuration of personality, quirks, values, and behaviors that constitute them, all of which emerged from causes they didn't ultimately control. And recognizing that people are products of their circumstances can actually deepen compassion and improve relationships. When your partner acts in ways that frustrate you, instead of thinking, they chose to be difficult, you can recognize they're stressed and reverting to old patterns shaped by their childhood. This doesn't excuse the behavior, but it makes it easier to respond with understanding rather than resentment. The political and social, IMPLICTUNS. The illusion of free will has profound implications for how we structure society. Criminal justice, as we've discussed, could be radically transformed by abandoning retributive justice in favor of a public health approach focused on prevention, rehabilitation, and humane incapacitation when necessary. Countries like Norway have moved in this direction, with prison systems focused on rehabilitation and dignity rather than punishment. The results speak for themselves. Norway has one of the lowest recidivism rates in the world, around 20%, compared to nearly 70% in the United States. when you stop seeing criminals as evil people who freely chose to be bad and instead see them as people whose brains generated harmful behaviors due to genetics, environment, trauma, mental illness, and circumstances, the entire approach changes. Education could be transformed by recognizing that academic performance is substantially influenced by factors students don't control. Genetics, early childhood nutrition, family stability, learning disabilities, attention spans shaped by technology use, stress from poverty. Instead of a meritocratic system that assumes everyone has equal opportunity and blames individuals for poor outcomes, we could design education systems that provide intensive support to those facing the greatest biological and environmental challenges. Finland's education system, often considered among the world's best, reflects this philosophy. Less emphasis on testing and competition, more emphasis on providing support tailored to individual needs, recognition that children come from different circumstances that affect learning. Economic inequality becomes harder to justify when you recognize that people don't ultimately choose their economic outcomes. Yes, some people work harder than others, are more intelligent, make better decisions. But these traits themselves are products of genetics and environment. Bill Gates didn't choose to be born with high intelligence, to have parents who could support his education, to have access to early computers, to grow up in a time and place where software entrepreneurship was possible. Steve Jobs didn't choose to be born with the particular combination of creativity, persuasiveness, and ruthlessness that made him successful. He was lucky in his genetic and environmental lottery. This doesn't mean we should have complete economic equality or eliminate all incentives. Incentives still work even without libertarian free will. They're part of the causal process that shapes behavior. But it does suggest that extreme inequality is harder to justify on moral grounds. Those who succeed didn't ultimately earn it through free choice any more than those who struggle freely chose their failure. Both are products of luck, genetic, developmental, circumstantial. This points towards stronger social safety nets, progressive taxation, investment in early childhood development, and efforts to break cycles of poverty, not as charity, but as recognition that people's economic outcomes are substantially determined by factors beyond their control. Personal health and addiction could be approached with more compassion and better outcomes. When someone struggles with addiction, obesity, or other health issues, the dominant cultural narrative is often one of personal failure and lack of willpower. If they just chose better, if they tried harder, they'd succeed. But addiction is fundamentally a brain disease. Some people are genetically predisposed to addiction. Childhood trauma changes brain development in ways that increase vulnerability. Stress, poverty, and lack of social support all increase risk. The addicted brain generates powerful cravings and impaired impulse control, not through free choice, but through neurobiological processes. Recognizing this leads to more effective treatment. Medication-assisted treatment, therapy addressing underlying trauma, environmental restructuring to remove triggers, social support systems. Not moral condemnation and shamming, which actually worsens outcomes. Parenting could be more compassionate and effective. When a child misbehaves, the traditional approach often involves punishment and moral judgment. You chose to do wrong, now you must suffer consequences. But understanding brain development and the absence of free will suggest a different approach. The child's brain is still developing, particularly the prefrontal cortex involved in impulse control. Their behavior is influenced by genetics, temperament, emotional regulation, abilities they haven't fully developed, modeling of adult behavior, stress levels, and a host of other factors they don't control. This doesn't mean no consequences. Children still need structure, boundaries, and feedback to learn appropriate behavior. But consequences can be framed as learning opportunities rather than deserved punishment. The focus shifts from moral judgment to skill building. You're learning to control your impulses, to consider others' feelings, to manage frustration. Research consistently shows that authoritative parenting, warm, supportive, with clear boundaries, produces better outcomes than authoritarian parenting based on punishment and control. Understanding that children aren't freely choosing to misbehave, but are struggling with developing brains, navigating complex social demands, naturally leads toward more authoritative approaches. The existential dimension, meaning in a determined universe. For many people, the most troubling aspect of abandoning free will isn't the practical implications, it's the existential implications. If I'm just a biological machine, operating according to physical laws, with no real agency or control, then what's the point? How can life have meaning? This question assumes that meaning requires libertarian free will, but that's not obvious. First, let's distinguish between cosmic or objective meaning and personal or subjective meaning. Is there a grand, universal purpose to existence, written into the fabric of reality by a deity or cosmic intelligence? Probably not. The universe seems indifferent to human concerns. We're a brief flicker in an unimaginably vast cosmos that existed for billions of years before us and will continue for billions after we're gone. But that doesn't mean your life lacks meaning. It just means meaning isn't handed to you from on high. You create it through what you care about. Albert Camus wrote about the absurd, the confrontation between our human need for meaning and the universe's silence. He argued we should imagine Sisyphus happy, condemned to roll a boulder up a hill for eternity, fully aware of the futility, yet finding meaning in the struggle itself, in the act of rebellion against absurdity. You don't need the universe to validate your choices or your values for them to matter to you. The love you feel for your children, the beauty you experience in music, the satisfaction of creating something, the connection you feel with friends, all of these are real experiences that constitute a meaningful life, regardless of whether you have libertarian free will or whether the universe cares. Second, understanding determinism can actually deepen appreciation for existence. When you recognize that your existence is the product of an unbroken chain of causation, stretching back 13.8 billion years, that you're made of atoms forged in the cores of dying stars, that those atoms somehow organize themselves into molecules that could replicate, that evolution through billions of years of life and death created the human brain, that your particular genetic lottery, combined with your particular life experiences, created the unique consciousness reading these words right now. There's something profoundly moving in that. You didn't choose to exist. You didn't earn it. You're staggeringly, cosmically lucky. The odds against you specifically existing are incomprehensibly vast. A slightly different sperm cell, slightly different timing, different historical events generations back, and you never would have been. This can inspire a sense of gratitude and wonder rather than nihilistic despair. You're getting to experience consciousness, to see colors and hear music, to feel emotions, to think thoughts, to love people, none of which you deserved or earned through free choice, all of which are gifts of improbable cosmic circumstance. Third, meaning comes from caring about things, not from freely choosing to care. You didn't choose to love your family, to be moved by sunsets, to value justice, to find mathematics beautiful. These values and preferences emerged from your particular brain, shaped by evolution and experience. But they're not less meaningful because you didn't freely choose them. In fact, they're more meaningful precisely because they're deeply rooted in who you are, not arbitrary selections from a menu of possible values. When you work toward goals you care about, when you spend time with people you love, when you experience beauty or learning or connection, these experiences constitute a meaningful life. The metaphysics of whether you freely chose to value these things is irrelevant to the lived experience of meaning. Fourth, many philosophers and scientists who deny free will report that this understanding enhanced rather than diminished their sense of meaning and well-being. Sam Harris describes experiencing greater peace and less ego-driven anxiety after deeply internalizing that free will is an illusion. When you stop identifying with thoughts and stop believing you're a separate self that needs to constantly defend itself and prove itself, there's a relaxation, an ease. Daniel Dennett argues that compatibilist free will, the ability to act according to your own desires and values, is the only kind of freedom worth wanting, and understanding that enhances rather than threatens meaning. Many Buddhist practitioners, who have been exploring the illusory nature of self for millennia, report that this understanding leads to greater compassion, less suffering, and more authentic connection with others. The paradox of choice in a determined world. Here's where we arrive at something genuinely paradoxical. You need to act as if you have free will, even while understanding you don't. When you're faced with a decision, you can't just shrug and say, well, whatever I do is determined, so it doesn't matter what I think about it. That very attitude would be part of the determining factors, and it would likely lead to poor outcomes. You need to deliberate, to consider consequences, to weigh options, to think carefully. This deliberation is itself part of the causal process that determines what you'll do. The quality of your deliberation affects the quality of your decision. So you must engage with choices as if they matter, because they do matter. They're part of the causal chain that shapes your future. The fact that they're determined doesn't make them less important. It's like the relationship between quantum mechanics and classical physics. At the quantum level, reality is probabilistic and weird. But at the macro level, classical physics works perfectly fine for navigating everyday life. You don't need to think about quantum superposition when catching a ball. Similarly, at the philosophical level, libertarian free will is an illusion. But at the practical level, you need to act as an agent making choices. Both perspectives are valid in their appropriate context. The key is holding both perspectives simultaneously, without letting one negate the other. When making decisions, engage fully, deliberate carefully, take responsibility for your choices. The practical perspective. When judging yourself or others, recognize that all behavior is the product of causes beyond ultimate control. Respond with compassion. Avoid unnecessary suffering from harsh moral judgment. The philosophical perspective. This is what the Buddhists call holding things lightly. Yes, make choices and pursue goals, but don't cling too tightly to outcomes. Don't identify so strongly with success or failure. Recognize the contingent, constructed nature of the self that's choosing. The hard problem of consciousness and free will. Before we conclude, we should briefly touch on consciousness itself, because the relationship between consciousness and free will is complex. The philosopher David Chalmers distinguishes between the easy problems of consciousness, understanding how the brain processes information, responds to stimuli, integrates data, and the hard problem. Why is there subjective experience at all? Why does it feel like something to be you? We can imagine a philosophical zombie, a being that processes information exactly like a human, responds appropriately to all stimuli, passes any behavioral test, but has no inner subjective experience. It's dark inside. Why aren't we zombies? Why is there something it's like to see red, to feel pain, to experience love? How do physical processes in neurons give rise to subjective qualia? This is arguably the deepest mystery in all of science and philosophy. We have no idea how to bridge the explanatory gap between objective, physical processes and subjective, qualitative experience. And this connects to free will because our intuition of free will is tied to our subjective experience of being a conscious agent. We don't just process information and produce outputs. We experience ourselves as deliberating, choosing, willing. Some philosophers, like Galen Strawson, argue that consciousness is fundamental to reality, not reducible to physical processes. If consciousness is fundamental, maybe it has causal powers that don't simply reduce to physics. Maybe there's room for libertarian free will after all. But most neuroscientists are skeptical. The overwhelming evidence is that consciousness is generated by brain activity. Damage specific brain regions, and specific aspects of consciousness disappear. Change neurochemistry, and conscious experience changes. Everything we know about consciousness suggests it's intimately dependent on physical brain states. Even if consciousness is in some sense fundamental or irreducible, that doesn't automatically give us contracausal free will. The conscious experience of choosing might still be generated after the brain has already initiated action, as Libet's experiments suggest. The hard problem of consciousness is real and profound, but it doesn't seem to offer an escape hatch for libertarian free will. What it does highlight is that consciousness itself, the fact that you're experiencing this moment, reading these words, having thoughts and feelings, is deeply mysterious and miraculous. We shouldn't take it for granted just because we experience it constantly. Conclusion: a new understanding of self and agency. We've traveled through neuroscience, philosophy, psychology, and contemplative practice. We've examined experiments showing the brain deciding before consciousness, explored the myriad ways our choices are shaped by factors we don't control, grappled with the implications for morality and meaning, and considered how to live authentically in a determined universe. So where does this leave us? The illusion of free will isn't a tragedy to be mourned. It's a reality to be understood and integrated. You are not some immaterial soul floating above your brain, pulling levers and making truly free choices unconstrained by physical reality. You are your brain. You're the product of billions of years of evolution, millions of neural connections, and every moment you've experienced. And that's not limiting. It's the only thing you could possibly be. You're not a simple agent making simple choices in a void. You're a vast, staggeringly complex system, shaped by your biology, your experiences, your environment, and the entire causal history of the universe that led to this moment. Your decisions aren't free in the magical sense of being uncaused, but they're yours. They emerge from the unique configuration of matter and energy that constitutes you. They're expressions of who you are, a who that you didn't ultimately create, but that nonetheless is doing the choosing. Understanding this doesn't make life meaningless. If anything, it makes it more meaningful. You didn't earn or deserve consciousness. You're astronomically lucky to have it. Every moment of experience, every connection with another person, every instance of beauty or learning or love, these are gifts of blind cosmic chance, temporary patterns of order in an entropic universe. Understanding this doesn't eliminate responsibility. You can still be held accountable for your actions, but the focus shifts from punishment to prevention, from retribution to rehabilitation, from judgment to compassion. Understanding this doesn't make self-improvement impossible. You can still work to become the person you want to be. You're just recognizing that you are a process, not a fixed entity, and you're participating in shaping that process even though you didn't choose the starting conditions. Understanding this doesn't destroy morality. Some actions reduce suffering and increase flourishing. Others do the opposite. These distinctions matter regardless of whether actions are freely chosen in the libertarian sense. Most profoundly, understanding the illusion of free will can reduce suffering, both your own and your suffering about others. When you genuinely internalize that you didn't ultimately choose your genes, your childhood, your brain chemistry, your temperament, your circumstances, that every difficulty you face is the product of causes beyond your control, it becomes easier to respond to yourself with compassion rather than harsh judgment. You can still work to change, but you can do so with kindness toward yourself, recognizing that you're doing the best you can given the brain and circumstances you were handed. And when others behave in ways that frustrate, anger, or hurt you, when you recognize they too are products of causes they didn't choose, that their actions emerge from their particular neurological and developmental history, it becomes easier to respond with understanding rather than vindictive judgment. This doesn't mean excusing harmful behavior. It means responding to it more effectively, with clear boundaries and consequences aimed at changing future behavior, rather than with moral outrage aimed at punishing deservedness. The question isn't whether you have free will. The question is, given that you're a physical system operating according to natural laws, given that you're embedded in an unbroken chain of causation, stretching back to the Big Bang and forward to the heat death of the universe, given that you didn't choose to exist, but here you are anyway, what do you want to do with this brief, improbable gift of conscious experience? How will you treat yourself? How will you treat others? What will you create, experience, learn, love in the time you have? These questions matter just as much, perhaps more. in a determined universe as they would in a universe with libertarian free will. Because even if it's all determined, you're still part of what's determining it. Your thoughts, your deliberations, your choices, these are real causal forces shaping the future, even if they themselves are shaped by the past. You're a node in the vast causal network of reality, a temporary configuration of matter experiencing itself, a pattern of information processing that somehow gives rise to love and curiosity and wonder. You don't have free will, but you have consciousness, agency, the ability to shape your future self and influence others, the capacity to reduce suffering and increase flourishing, the privilege of experiencing this strange, beautiful, terrible, amazing universe. And in the end, that might be enough. It might even be everything. So here's my final challenge. For the next week, pay attention. Notice your choices arising. Notice thoughts appearing without your permission. Notice how your mood affects your decisions. Notice how your environment shapes your behavior. Notice the feeling of being a unified self and question whether that feeling corresponds to reality. You won't suddenly gain free will through this observation, but you might gain something more valuable: clarity about what you actually are, compassion for yourself and others, and freedom from the tyranny of believing you should have complete control when control was never possible. You might not have free will, but you have awareness. You have this moment. You have the ability to participate consciously in the unfolding of reality, to be a force for reducing suffering and increasing flourishing, to experience beauty and connection and wonder. In a determined universe, maybe that's the closest thing to freedom we'll ever get. And maybe, just maybe, that's enough. Thank you for taking this journey with me. Whether you chose to watch this entire video or were always going to watch, it doesn't matter nearly as much as the fact that you did. And that shared experience, that connection between your consciousness and mine through these ideas, that's real, regardless of the metaphysics of free will. Until next time, be kind to yourself and others. You're all doing the best you can with the brains you were given.